Over the course of the last 24 hours, one senses a certain backtracking on the part of Western governments on the question of authorizing Ukraine, as they say, to launch missile strikes on Russian territory. The key statements have come from the United States, and we've had statements from all three top officials, from all three institutions of the US government that are responsible for policy with Ukraine: the National Security Council, the Pentagon, and the State Department. The first comment that I saw was from the State Department, and it's from State Department spokesman Matthew Miller. And Matthew Miller told reporters, "Our policy has been that we don't encourage or enable strikes outside Ukraine's borders. We always discuss with our allies whatever is on their mind, and we have those meetings, but I don't have anything further." So that's in the State Department. The policy of not authoring missile strikes on Russian territory is unchanged. The Pentagon has then chimed in and said the same. And this is from Deputy Pentagon Press Secretary Sabrina Singh. "Our position hasn't changed. I can't speak for other countries. I can only speak for us." And this was in connection with a question about whether Washington had changed its position that Ukraine should be allowed to use US-supplied weapons to hit targets inside Russia. And John Kirby, who is the, well, you can call him the spokesman of the National Security Council, the most senior of the three, he's come out and he's essentially said the same thing, that the policy has not been changed. The United States does not authorize use of its weapons by Ukraine to attack the territory of Russia, or to be more precise, of pre-2014 Russia, which is, of course, the Russia that the United States recognizes as Russian. Now, these three statements have come on the same day as President Vladimir Putin delivered the strongest warning on this issue and the most explicit warning on this issue that he has made up to this point. And the warning is in the starkest terms, and it was given over the course of a press conference which he gave in the Uzbek capital of Tashkent, where he has been on a state visit. Now, I find it astonishing that this warning from Putin has gone almost entirely unreported in the Western media, and that it has not been discussed publicly or responded to by Western governments. But anyway, this is what he had to say about this issue. With regard to strikes, and I'm not frankly sure what NATO Secretary General, that is Stoltenberg, is talking about. This is Stoltenberg, of course, has announced that he is supportive of this policy. When he was the Prime Minister of Norway, we communicated and addressed challenging issues concerning the Barents Sea and other issues, and generally we were able to come to terms, and I'm positive he was not suffering from dementia back then. If he's talking about potentially attacking Russia's territory with long-range precision weapons, he, as a person who heads a military political organization, should be aware of the fact that long-range precision weapons cannot be used without space-based reconnaissance. This is the first point. The second point is that the final target selection and what is known as launch mission can only be made by highly skilled specialists who rely on this reconnaissance data, technical reconnaissance data. For some attack systems, such as Storm Shadow, these launch missions can be put in automatically without the need to use Ukrainian military. Who does it? Those who manufacture and those who allegedly supply these attack systems to Ukraine do. This can and does happen without the participation of the Ukrainian military. Launching other systems, such as ATACMS, for example, also relies on space reconnaissance data. Targets are identified and automatically communicated to the relevant crews that may not even realize what exactly they're putting in. A crew may be even a Ukrainian crew that puts the corresponding launch, then puts in the corresponding launch missile. However, the mission is put together by representatives of NATO countries, not the Ukrainian militaries. So these officials from NATO countries, especially the ones based in Europe, particularly in small European states, should be fully aware of what is at stake. They should keep in mind that theirs are small and densely populated countries, which is a factor to reckon with before they start talking about striking deep into Russian territory. It is a serious matter, and without a doubt, we are watching this very closely. More broadly, this unending escalation can lead to serious consequences. If Europe were to face those serious consequences, what will the United States do, considering our strategic parity? It is hard to tell. Are they looking for a global conflict? I think they wanted to agree upon strategic arms, but we do not really see them being eager to do so. They're talking about it, but are not doing much to make it happen. We will wait and see what happens next. So, what is Putin saying? He's saying two things. He says that long-range cruise missiles, and note that he is homed in onto the issue of long-range cruise missiles. Minor drone attacks by Ukraine, pinprick attacks by basically small drones that can only do limited amount of damage are one thing, even if some of these drones have a Western provenance. Rocket attacks using vampire rockets and artillery shells and that kind of thing across the border, well, again, that's also one thing. But missile strikes, long-range cruise missile strikes using guided cruise missiles against Russian targets well inside Russia, first and foremost, they can only happen with the direct participation and involvement of the West. The West needs to provide the satellite and targeting and reconnaissance data, and in terms of the missiles in question, the Storm Shadows, the ATACMS, and though he doesn't, of course, mention them, the Taurus missiles as well. These attacks can only take place with the direct participation and involvement of Western militaries. And then he goes on to say that this is an utterly reckless move, that Western governments who undertake this, European governments especially, should bear in mind that they are relatively small countries with dense populations, that if they want to get into a missile war with the Russians, then the damage that could potentially be done to them would be huge, potentially huge, and certainly not of a sort that they would want to see. And of course, with the small European countries and it's clear here that he's talking principally about the Baltic states. The risks become even greater. And as for the United States, well, it needs to remember that in terms of nuclear forces, what exists between Russia and the United States is strategic nuclear parity. If the United States thinks it can intervene alongside its European allies and threaten Russia, well, Russia is in a position to mount similar and identical threats against the United States. And he says that this is a case of unending escalation, which can lead to serious consequences. If Europe were to face those consequences, those serious consequences, in other words, if the Europeans want to go down this disastrous rabbit hole, what will the United States do? It's essentially a demand by Putin that not only the Americans reconsider this decision, but that they rein in their European allies, the Baltic states and the others, whom we're going to come to in a moment, who are coming up with these disastrous ideas. And lastly, he says that the United States has in the past talked about undertaking negotiations about strategic arms with the Russians. It even continues to say that it wants to undertake those sort of negotiations. And how can such negotiations happen if proposals of the kind that are being floated at the moment for missile strikes deep inside Russia ever achieve reality? And last but not least, he asks rhetorically, are they looking for a global conflict? And again, I come back to that point which I made in various programs, that the Russians have also made clear, specifically to the British, but the same warning obviously applies to the United States, and by the way, France also, that if there are missile strikes onto Russian territory, Russia reserves the right to retaliate against military targets of the countries responsible: Britain, France, the United States, potentially Germany, anywhere in the world. Britain, France, and the United States, of course, have military facilities all over the world, all across the globe, and a potential global conflict at that point starts to become a distinct possibility, with all the catastrophic consequences that would arise. Well, Putin's words, perhaps they are elliptical in some places, but their meaning is absolutely clear. This is, diplomatically speaking, an extremely stark warning to the Western powers, and it's almost certainly been a warning that has been conveyed by the Russians to the United States through private means, and these statements that have come from the US officials, from Matthew Miller, from Sabrinder Singh, and from Admiral Kirby, well, they suggest that for the moment, these warnings from the Russians have had their effect. Now, there's been a NATO meeting, and there's also been a meeting between France and Germany, and we're beginning to see who the countries are who support this idea and who don't. The Baltic states clearly are in favor of this plan. They've spoken about it. They're clearly the small countries that Putin has been talking about. I suspect that Poland is divided on this question. Radek Sikorski, who is the Polish foreign minister, is an extreme hardliner where Russia is concerned. He's married to Anne Applebaum, an American journalist and commentator, who I think, I would say straightforwardly, in my opinion, takes consistently hardline neocon positions where Russia is concerned. And I think Sikorski mirrors them, and he's done so in the past as well. But I think general mood in Poland, including in the Polish government, is not as united on this question as Sikorski's words might suggest. Italy is straightforwardly opposed. Germany appears to be opposed also. Over the course of what I suspect was a far from happy meeting with Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron came up with the usual unsatisfactory but extremely dangerous and aggressive supposed compromise on this question. This is to allow the Ukrainians to launch strikes on Russian facilities inside Russia that are launching strikes against Ukraine, but only against those particular targets. And Scholz, who was with Macron, appeared to agree, but he did so in such evasive terms that I'm not sure that one can take his agreement as real. He continues, apparently, to be full square opposed to the supply of Taurus missiles to Ukraine, without which, to be realistic, this plan is not really fully workable, because it seems to me that only the Taurus missiles have the real potential to do the damage, or rather to only have the full potential and the full range to do the kind of damage that the Ukrainians undoubtedly want. Anyway, probably Scholz did not want to argue with Macron in public, but the sense I get is that the Germans are not keen on this idea. The Italians and other countries in Europe have made clear that they are straightforwardly opposed. And with the Americans coming out to oppose it, I think for the moment, this idea is dead. I say for the moment because the consistent pattern over the course of this conflict is that these terrible ideas, what Putin referred to as the unending escalation, what I once described as the escalatory escalator, that eventually resumes its upward course, and that these disastrous ideas, once they have been killed, come back and are resurrected and are eventually put into effect. I suspect that at some point, as Ukraine's situation continues to deteriorate, continues to go from bad to worse, somewhere, somehow, the American government will change its stance, and the approval for this disastrous plan will eventually be given, with all of the dangerous consequences that Putin is speaking about. Now, Putin didn't just give the starkest warning he has ever given against this idea of missile strikes. And perhaps before I continue, I should make it clear what his warning is. He says if the Western powers launch missile strikes against Russia from European territory using European weapons, the Russians will strike back, both presumably at the launch positions in Ukraine, but also potentially against the European countries that are involved in conducting these strikes, and that if the United States allows the use of ATACMS missiles, then the Russians will assist, doubtless, others to conduct attacks against US military facilities around the world. To repeat again, he said, are they looking for a global conflict? That's clearly what he means. And Putin is also saying that if the United States tries to intervene itself, then it needs to remember that it is functioning in a state of strategic nuclear parity as between the United States and Russia. The Russians, within the terms of their own doctrines, might regard any intervention, in fact, probably almost certainly would regard any intervention by the United States in this kind of missile war, given that the targets, the missiles, are being launched against targets in Russia as an attack upon itself by the United States, at which point the United States could potentially find itself in a World War III situation with a nuclear superpower, Russia, which has the capability to destroy the United States. It's, as I said, an extremely stark warning, and it is incredible that it is not being published or discussed or talked about, as it certainly should be in Europe, in the West, in the United States, or in Britain. For the record, I think that the reason warnings like this coming from Putin, and these are real warnings, and many of the supposed threats he's made to use nuclear weapons that he's alleged to have made, he has never made. They're based on misrepresentations and misconstructions of things that he has said, and sometimes outright inventions about things that he is supposed to have said but never had. But this time, his words are strong and clear. The fact that Western governments are not talking about them, again, I have to say this, I think straightforwardly, this is because they do not want to discuss these dangerous plans with their populations, who are not in any way supportive of plans of this kind, and who I think would be appalled if they knew that their leaders are discussing ideas which the Russians are warning might lead to an outright nuclear confrontation and to a nuclear war. Now, of course, in the United States and in Britain, elections are currently underway, and there is an even stronger imperative, therefore, to avoid discussing issues like this at this time, in order, obviously, to keep this discussion as closed as possible. In Britain especially, it is remarkable how the whole question of the Ukraine war is not featuring at all in the general election, which is currently underway. Just saying. But anyway, a very stark warning from Putin. As I said, for the moment at least, it looks like the Americans are heeding it. Macron is coming up, as he always does, with his bizarre ideas. This is a particularly bizarre idea that he's coming up with. He says, we can strike at some places in Russia, but not at other places, as if the Russians are going to accept whatever distinctions Macron makes. But anyway, there it is. That's the situation at the moment. For the moment, there's been a backing off from this dangerous idea, but that doesn't mean, as I said, that it won't come, and that the situation doesn't remain extremely dangerous. Now, it was not the only thing that Putin was talking about in this really very astonishing press conference. He also discussed at considerable length the question of President Zelensky's legitimacy, and he finally, I think, came clear on this. He made it absolutely clear that the Russians no longer consider Zelensky to be the legitimate president of Ukraine. And I'm going to read out his comments again, precisely. He said this: the first question was about the legitimacy of the quest of the Ukrainian power. Indeed, it is necessary to conduct a serious, deep analysis of this. The first point is on the surface and is mentioned by my colleagues. This is what it is about. The Constitution of Ukraine only extends the powers of the Rada, that's the Ukrainian parliament. It says nothing about extending the powers of the president. This is the first point. What Putin is saying is that the Ukrainian constitution, as he understands it, and as I understand it too, says that when Parliament, the Ukrainian Parliament, authorizes the enactment of martial law, then parliamentary elections cannot take place and the term of the Parliament is extended, but it is silent on the question of the president. It appears to leave open the possibility of presidential elections, and therefore it does not appear to extend the term of the president. By the way, as I said in a previous program, my own reading of the Ukrainian constitution is the same. But again, I want to stress I am not an authority on this question. But anyway, let's see what further Putin had to say. He then went on to say this: the law of Ukraine on the legal status, this is another law, not the constitution, the legal position and martial law reads that presidential elections are not held during martial law. This is not the constitution. This is a separate law. It says that the actual law on enacting martial law prohibits presidential elections from taking place. However, this does not mean that they are extended. In other words, the fact that there are no presidential elections can take place according to the martial law decree does not in itself extend the term of the presidency, of the president. They're not held, but who said they must be extended? The elections cannot be held, but who says that the term of the president is thereby extended? The Constitution, he's now going back to the Constitution, says nothing about this. But Article 111 of the Constitution of Ukraine reads that in this case, the powers of the supreme authority, actually the presidential powers, are transferred to the Speaker of Parliament. All the more so since the powers of Parliament are extended during martial law. This is a preliminary analysis. We should take a deeper look into this issue. Now, I have discussed this many times. Vladimir Putin has a legal training. He has a law degree. It is my belief, which I cannot obviously verify, and which you will not find mentioned in any one of the various biographies of Putin which I've consulted, but it is my belief that in some form or other, he has actually practiced law, because he speaks and writes too much like a lawyer, for that not to be the case. For the record, I think he was a legal officer when he worked inside the KGB all those years ago, back in the 1980s. But anyway, this is Putin the lawyer conducting what lawyers call legal construction. In other words, interpreting legal documents. And he is using classic legal criteria when undertaking construction. He says that you don't see in a legal document that which is not there. If neither the Constitution nor the law itself, the martial law act itself, specifically and expressly extend the power of the president, then the president's power is not extended, and as the Constitution provides, authority is vested in the Parliament, whose term, according to the Constitution, is extended. Now, as I said, that's classic legal interpretation of documents. It's exactly the approach that most lawyers take, but of course most lawyers are not the same necessarily as Ukrainian lawyers. And then, of course, continuing to wear his legal hat, Professor of Law Vladimir Putin goes on to say this: some specialists say that there are contradictions between the Constitution that provides only for the extension of the Rada's powers under martial law and the law I have just mentioned. I think it is the 2016 law that defines the legal status of martial law. As I said and repeat, this law stipulates that the presidential elections are not held, but nothing is said about the prolongation, and he means the prolongation of the president's term, and this is the problem. And so he says, some people obviously take a different view from me, but I've read the Constitution, I've read the law, I'm applying classical techniques of legal analysis or construction, if you prefer, and I've come up with this answer, and it seems to me to be the obvious one. And of course, when I say Putin, he's clearly had advice about this. The legal team in the Russian Foreign Ministry has obviously been looking through these constitutional documents, the Ukrainian constitution and Ukraine's law on martial law, the 2016 law, and has come to this conclusion. And the conclusion, rather, that Putin sets out. And then he moves from legal analysis to actual politics, policy. He says, what is the point? The point is that, in essence, Ukrainian statehood is based on the idea of the parliamentary presidential republic rather than a presidential republic. The main levers of power are concentrated in the representative state body, by which he means, of course, the Ukrainian parliament. Therefore, it is quite logical that the constitution itself and other legal acts are adopted on its basis, are constructed in such a way, are construed in such a way. Therefore, strictly speaking, in a tentative estimate, I'm just talking about a tentative estimate, the Parliament and the Speaker of the Rada, the Speaker of the Parliament, remain the only legitimate power. And so, basically, if they want to hold presidential elections, they should have simply repealed martial law at that time and held elections, but they did not want to do this for a number of reasons. I think, and this is not linked with the Constitution in any way, that maybe the current bosses of Ukraine who are overseas would like to place the burden of making all unpopular decisions on the current executive branch. This includes the adoption of yet another decision to further lower the conscription age. It was 27, now it's 25, and next it may be 23 or even 18. I believe that after this and other unpopular decisions are made, those who are acting today as representatives of executive government would be replaced with people who would not be responsible for the unpopular decisions made. Though these representatives will be simply replaced in a snap. If this is the idea, the logic is understandable in principle. Let's see what happens next. But as I said in Minsk, the final say should be made by the political and legal system of Ukraine. It should formulate and explain what is happening in Ukraine. I believe this is not too difficult. Indeed, I will repeat for the third time that the 2016 law prohibits holding presidential elections under martial law, but nothing is said about extension of the president's powers. So what? See Article 111 of the Constitution. All power is transferred to the Speaker of the Parliament. So what he's basically saying is that technically, according to his understanding of all of these legal documents, the Ukrainian Constitution and Ukrainian law, Zelensky is clearly an illegitimate president. He should not continue in office since martial law in Ukraine remains in effect. The person who, under the law and the Constitution of Ukraine, is or ought to be the Speaker of Ukraine's Parliament, which is the only body of state power which, in a situation of martial law, has its term extended beyond the election period. But though Putin says that this is his understanding and that he is clearly, obviously confident that he is right, he also says, in effect, that all of this is academic because this is not what this is all about. What he's saying is that the Western powers, who he believes pull the strings in Kiev, are perfectly well aware that Zelensky is illegitimate. They want to leave him in place for the moment, despite the fact that he is illegitimate, so that he can continue to enact unpopular measures like the recent mobilization decree. But now that he is clearly illegitimate, they can remove him whenever they like and dispense with him because he is both illegitimate and unpopular. So the Western powers, according to Putin, have availed themselves of a situation where they could quite easily and simply, if they chose, enact a coup. They can remove Zelensky from his position whenever they please. Well, I am not going to comment further about about Putin's legal analysis about Zelensky's illegitimacy. The point to take from all of this is that Putin no longer considers Zelensky to be the legitimate president of Ukraine. The further point is that since Putin believes that Zelensky is only in power now because of the qualified and conditional support of the West, there is clearly no further point in negotiating with him. He can be removed from power at the snap of the fingers of whoever is the current occupier of the White House. So there's no point in negotiating with Zelensky, or indeed with anyone else, until proper elections take place. The only people that Russia can negotiate with on the Ukrainian issue are the Western powers, the United States first and foremost, because they are the parties now that are in effect in control. That is essentially, again, what Putin is saying. Now, it seems that that Putin, or rather the Russians, might also have another particular card up their sleeve. In my last program, I mentioned that it appears that former president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, attended the summit meeting, or at least visited Minsk, over the course of the summit meeting that took place there between Putin and Lukashenko. And there are further reports that since that meeting in Minsk, after the end of that summit meeting in Minsk, Yanukovych has returned to Russia, where he lives in exile, but instead of remaining in his place of exile, which I believe is Rostov, he is now in Moscow, where he has been meeting with Russian officials. Now, I haven't seen this confirmed anywhere authoritative, but I understand that that is the rumour. Since Yanukovych is the last, according to Putin, indisputable president of Ukraine, it may be that as the conflict moves on and as we approach the moment of crisis in Ukraine, it could be that the Russians do have a plan to parachute him in, get the Rada to endorse him as president. The Rada, the Russians probably think, is a more malleable institution than Zelensky himself. After all, the Rada, which in 2014 had been dominated by Yanukovych's party, the Party of the Regions, following his overthrow, reversed itself completely and went over to complete support for the Maidan movement. So maybe the reverse can happen in the future, who's to say? But anyway, maybe in that case, Yanukovych can somehow be reinstalled in power as president of Ukraine, in which case, of course, the Russians can come to all kinds of agreements with him, agreements which the Russians will say are legal and constitutionally proper, and which they can move forward with. I'm not saying definitely that this is the Russian plan, but it is very like the way Putin likes to do things. He has always worked inside a legal framework for all of his acts. Contrary to what is said in the West, he is very, very careful not to appear too obviously to step outside the law and to act on a totally arbitrary basis. I'm not saying that all of his actions have been legal, but anyway, the point is that he's always got a legal framework which he can use to justify legally what he has done. As I said, he is an ex-lawyer, and this is very much how he likes to work. And I can see that both he and other officials in the Russian government might quite conceivably be thinking along these lines. But whether they really are, that, of course, as Putin himself says in the other context, as the words that he himself has just used in this press conference, well, that remains to be seen. So, very interesting press conference, one of the most interesting Putin has ever given on the Ukraine war. An absolutely stark warning to the West and first and foremost to the United States, one that the Americans at least seem to be heeding for the moment. A warning specifically about this plan to launch missile strikes on Russian territory. And also a very interesting discussion about Ukrainian constitutional issues, one which not only confirms Zelensky's illegitimacy and therefore the pointlessness of negotiations with him, but which might in future open the way for the Russians to construct in Kiev a new system of power, possibly based or created around the personality of Viktor Yanukovych and utilizing the powers of the Ukrainian parliament with which the Russians might in future negotiate instead. Gives us some idea of the kind of thinking that might be taking place in Moscow within Putin's circle within the Russian government. And I should say that coming from Putin himself, we should take all of this an awful lot more seriously than all those rumours and gossip and tittle-tattle from anonymous Russian personalities supposedly informed about what Putin is thinking, that we see from time to time cropping up in places like Reuters, AP, and other parts of the Western media. So, anyway, that's where we are for the moment. Let's put all this aside. Let's now look at the situation on the battlefronts. And I'm going to say, first of all, that again, we're getting very gloomy assessments about the state of the war in the West. I saw this article, for example, in the Daily Telegraph, which straightforwardly says that Ukraine is being defeated and that it knows this. The article actually straightforwardly says this, and that Ukraine knows that it's not going to be successful in the war in Ukraine. And it's interesting because I can see that the Daily Telegraph, having published this article, apparently thought it might be a bit too depressing, so that it immediately has taken it down. But that was what it said. And we've had, for the Ukrainians, more bad news. They've now been told again, apparently, that they must not expect to join NATO, any pathway towards joining NATO at the forthcoming NATO summit meeting in August. And the United States and Germany are apparently united on this question. And Chancellor Scholz has appeared to float the possibility that it might take up to 30 years before Ukraine joins NATO. Zelensky is very bitter about this, and he's openly complaining about it. But anyway, that tells us again that there is a gloomy view about the overall situation on the battlefronts. Now, if what the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is telling us is also true, and I'm referring now to certain comments made by the Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, then the situation for Ukraine is not only already very bad, but it is probably likely soon to become terminal. Because according to Umerov, there are now 500,000 Russian troops engaged in the conflict zone with Ukraine, but they are about to be joined by 300,000 more. And Umerov seems to be suggesting that the place where these Russian troops will attack is in the north, not just in Sumy region, but in the direction of Kiev itself. And I would say if the Russians are indeed intending to hurl a force of 300,000 men towards Kiev, this is a force that is multiple times greater than the one that was deployed close to Kiev in the spring of 2022. That force, the force that we were hearing so much about at the time, there's been discussions as to how large it actually was, but the estimates vary between 25,000, which I would put as the absolute lowest estimate, right up to 50,000, which was identified as the very highest. 300,000 is more than 10 or 6 times more than the force that arrived before Kiev in 2022. And for the record, given the state of the Ukrainian army, given its exhaustion, given the crisis, the continued crisis on the front lines, I think that if 300,000 Russian troops arrived before Kiev, I think that the Ukrainians would not be able to resist them. And if the Russians really are planning to attack and storm Kiev with such a force, then they would be able to do so. I don't think the Ukrainians would have the means to defend themselves, to defend Kiev against a Russian force this size. Now, I am going to say straight away, I don't know that the Russian objective is Kiev. No official in Russia has mentioned anything like this. I don't know that the Russian plan is to launch 300,000 extra men against Ukraine at all. There's been a lot of talk about a Russian incursion into Sumy region, and there's been undoubtedly a lot of shelling and fire, exchanges of fire there, and the Russian Air Force has been active in that area also, and there's been some reports of Russian reconnaissance groups operating in that part of the world too. But so far, there has not been a major Russian advance into Sumy region of the sort that we saw in Kharkiv region. But, as I've said again, if Umerov is right, but he might be, then if the Russians are about to commit a force of this size to the war, over and above the one they have already committed, in my opinion, it is curtains for Ukraine. I do not think that Ukraine has the means, the strength to withstand an attack. In fact, it would be an avalanche on this sort of scale. Now, I would add that I don't know whether Umerov is right or wrong, but I do believe that the Russians have the forces to add another 300,000 men to the conflict zone, if that is what they decide to do. In 2022, they did not have reserves on that sort of scale, trained and mobilized and fully equipped reserves on that kind of scale. Today, in 2024, they do. How they intend to use them, whether they intend to use them at all, that I don't know. But I can very well understand why Umerov and other officials in Ukraine and officials in Western governments are becoming increasingly worried and nervous about the situation. Anyway, what in the meantime is actually taking place on the battlefronts? Well, before I proceed with that, can I just say that we've had more news over the course of the last few hours that more Ukrainian drones have been intercepted trying to attack the Voronezh radar, the early warning radar that the Russians have in the town of Armavir. And the attacks, according to the Russians, were repelled. The drones were destroyed. I think the Russians are now aware of the drone threat to Armavir and to the other radar stations. They have all the means they need to deal with these drones. I don't think it will require a major commitment of resources. I think the reason that these drones were able to get through to Armavir at all in the first place was because the Russians did not expect such a reckless attack on this sort of facility. But I think that from this point onwards, Armavir and the other radar stations are going to be very well protected. And I think the period of time, the opening Ukraine had to attack these radar stations is now closing. I want to stress, attack these radar stations with drones. Of course, missiles, cruise missiles, as we've been discussing, that is a different question altogether. Now, there's been some discussion on the military summary channel that the attack on these two radar stations, the one in Armavir and the one in Orsk, in Orenburg region, that their purpose was not so much to damage Russia's early warning system in terms of American ICBM launches, but rather to prevent, to obstruct Russian satellites, Russian radar tracking of potential American or conceivably Israeli launches towards Iran. This is because these two radars are face southwards towards the Persian Gulf and the Middle East, and have apparently been used in the past. They're what are called over-the-horizon radars to keep track of Israeli missile launches. And by the way, I think that is highly possible. The Israelis have, as we've seen, got themselves into a confrontation with Iran recently. There was an exchange of missile strikes recently between Israel and Iran following the Israeli attack on the Iranian embassy building in Damascus. It's entirely plausible that the Israelis might be saying that if they need to carry out a similar attack in the near future, or if they do, in fact, have a plan to carry out such an attack on facilities in Iran in the near future, then they might need or would need to shut down these radar stations to enable that kind of attack to take place without fear that the Russians, who are now closely allied to the Iranians, would not only track the Israeli missile launches, but would give advance warning to the Iranians that these missile launches had taken place. Now, the reason that might be the case is because over the last few months, the relationship between Israel and Russia, which used to be fairly cordial and quite close. I can remember the days when Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, was not only an honored guest in Moscow, but an honored guest who was invited to attend the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow. I believe that was in 2017. Anyway, those days are gone. Relations between Israel and Russia have deteriorated markedly over the course of the Gaza crisis. Israel is now quite openly siding with Ukraine against Russia, though for the moment there's no reports that it has supplied military equipment to Ukraine. But it's not inconceivable that the Israelis have made promises of assistance to Ukraine, maybe with air defense systems and that kind of thing, in return for the Ukrainians launching these sort of radar attacks on Russian radar stations. It's not impossible. Now, if this is what is indeed happening, then in one respect it is reassuring. It would make it more likely that it is the Israelis rather than the US that was directly involved. But on the other hand, it would be very alarming indeed, because the fact that the Israelis are now, in effect, instigating attacks on Russian radar stations by Ukraine, well, that would suggest that there really is some kind of Israeli plan to strike at Iran, and that they want these Russian radar stations out of the way. If this is indeed what is happening, Israel is playing an extremely reckless game. The Russians will certainly be making the kind of assessments that the Military Summary Channel and I have made on this program. They have extensive information sources, including in Ukraine itself, by the way. They will certainly not only figure this out, but get information that will confirm it, and that will no doubt make them harden their positions against Israel even further, and by the way also harden still further their support for Iran. Moreover, this is a particularly dangerous game, since, as these drone attacks have shown, the Ukrainians, for the moment at least, lack the capability to attack these Russian radar stations, to cause them significant damage, much less destroy them. If this is what is happening, then it seems to me that it's a case of two beleaguered governments coming together, striking out against what they both see as a joint enemy, and behaving increasingly recklessly with each other. On the Ukrainian side, I have to say this is par for the course. It's happened many times. On the Israeli side, I'm afraid it is consistent with other moves that the Israelis have been taking recently, such as the recent threats one of their officials apparently made against one of the investigators of the ICC. There we are. Now, I'm not going to discuss this issue further because I don't want to plunge too far into speculation. The other thing I'm going to say is that, of course, if this is indeed what's happening, is that the Russians will obviously inform the Iranians. And by the way, on that topic, since I'm talking about relations between Russia and Iran, over the course of one of his press conference in Minsk, I noticed that Putin disclosed something else, which I found completely astonishing, and it related to the recent death of the Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi. I've asked repeatedly the question of why President Raisi was flying on a 40 to 50-year-old American Bell 212 helicopter that apparently not received proper maintenance because of sanctions, when Iranian officials could, if they wish, avail themselves of far more advanced and much more modern and far better maintained and well supplied helicopters from Russia and China. Well, Putin disclosed that the presidential convoy, the President Raisi's presidential convoy, on his trip to Azerbaijan, consisted of three helicopters. The one that he flew on, the Bell 212, and the two helicopters that the other Iranian officials and staffers flew on, both of which, it turns out, were Russian. Putin didn't identify the makes of these helicopters, but I'm going to guess that they were Mi-17s, which are extremely advanced and very powerful helicopters, much bigger and more powerful than the old Bell 212, and which are specifically designed for operating in mountainous conditions. Why was the president of Iran allowed to travel on an ancient American helicopter that might not have received adequate servicing, as opposed to the far more advanced and more powerful and much bigger and more comfortable Russian helicopters that he could have traveled in safely in instead? Anyway, I bring that up just as a piece of parenthesis. Let's move back to the conflict situation in Ukraine. Now, there's been an interesting discussion, a very interesting discussion, about the situation in the Kharkiv area, which appeared yesterday in Redovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, which I've said many times, reports from the nationalist, patriotic side of the Russian political spectrum, but which nonetheless appears to be extremely well informed about the conduct of the war. I suspect they have their sources within the Russian military, and I get the sense that their reporters are also present in many places along the battlefronts. Anyway, Redovka says that there have indeed been Ukrainian counterattacks in the Kharkiv area, in Lipsy and Volchansk. And they also say, Redovka also says, that these counterattacks have been completely unsuccessful, that the Ukrainians in both places were able to gain a small amount of territory, but that this territory was not effective for them, and that the Russians have contained their advances and inflicted very heavy losses on the Ukrainians. And in relation to Volchansk, which is arguably, at least in my opinion, the more important battle, Redovka says that the situation for the Ukrainians is not only very bad, following the failure of their counterattack, but is deteriorating. And Redovka appears to confirm what a number of other sources are also confirming. The point I made some days ago, that it looks as if the Ukrainian forces north of the Volcha River, in what looks to be a shrinking pocket, are effectively trapped. So that's Redovka's analysis of the situation in Kharkiv. It's the most thorough and detailed, and as far as I could see, the best informed analysis that I've seen. There were more reports earlier this morning, by the way, of Russian advances in the Lipsy area, close to the area where the Ukrainians are supposed to have carried out their counterattack. It's suggested, Redovka suggested yesterday, that the Ukrainians would be unable to retain the small amount of ground that they had recaptured. And looking at the maps and things that various people have been producing, I can see why that might be so, by the way, if this report from Redovka is true. But for the record, the Russian attack, the Russian advance, that some sources are claiming has taken place was not a counterattack to recover this territory, but an attack that appears to be very close to where this territory is located, but which seems to be intended to advance and capture several more villages to the west, to the east of Lipsy. I'm not going to pretend that I understand the tactical nature of the battle here. I simply make this point that there does seem to have been an attempt by the Ukrainians to conduct counterattacks over the last couple of days. The Russians, and I think Redovka is pretty authoritative, are reporting that these attacks overall have failed, that the Ukrainians have recovered some ground, but only a few hundred meters of ground, and that Russian advances are still taking place, and that a significant number of Ukrainian troops in Volchansk continue to be surrounded. What is indisputable is that the Russians are continuing to inflict massive losses against the Ukrainian forces in this specific area. And the Russians, for example, have reported that over the last 24 hours, Ukraine lost 165 troops in this relatively small area of the fighting in Kharkiv. It was much more than that over the previous days. I believe the day before it was 280. But they are also doing very heavy damage to Ukraine's artillery forces. The Russian Defense Ministry is reporting today that 2 infantry fighting vehicles, 7 motor vehicles, 1 152mm D-20 howitzer, 1 US-made 155mm Paladin self-propelled artillery system, 2 electronic warfare systems, and an ammunition dump were destroyed precisely in this very area. And yesterday, I think that the Russians claimed even more artillery forces and hardware, Ukrainian hardware, were destroyed in this area, including a Caesar, a French Caesar howitzer. So anyway, that is what the Russians are claiming. They are also claiming that they're inflicting enormous losses on the Ukrainians. Elsewhere on the battle lines, in the area of Siversk, in the area, in that specific area, in the area where the Yug forces are fighting, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that that Ukraine actually lost a total of 700 men in the fighting around Siversk, which seems an astonishingly high number. It's off the scale, and it does make one wonder exactly what is going on in that particular part of the battlefronts. But anyway, suffice to say, this is Ukrainian losses at the moment are enormously high right across the battle lines. But anyway, to return elsewhere on the battlefronts, to the extent that we're getting news, situation continues to deteriorate for the Ukrainians. The most dramatic news over the last 24 hours is that the Russians appear to be on the brink of recapturing Staromayorsk in the Vremivka salient area. It's one of those 2 villages, Staromayorsk and Orozhaine, that the Ukrainians suffered huge losses trying to capture during their offensive last year in the summer, when the Ukrainians claimed to have captured Staromayorsk and Urozhaine, it was said to be a huge victory which would open the way for a further advance all the way to Mariupol. Well, that obviously didn't happen, but it looks as if the Russians are about to recapture both of these villages, and it looks as if, and probably by the end of the day, it will be the case that the Russians have now recaptured Staromayorsk. But anyway, I have to say, I still don't think that the fighting in the Vremivka salient area is the most important area of the fighting. My continued understanding is that the main battle continues to be the one that's playing out in Chasiv Yar, and there's been further reports in Chasiv Yar, by the way, that the Russians have made more advances and within the village of Kalinivka, northeast of Chasiv Yar. It looks as if the Russians are gradually gaining control of this village. The fighting in the micro-district east of the aqueduct continues on a horrific scale. And as I said already, with Klishevka and Andreevka captured, the Russians continue to expand control along the line of the aqueduct to the south of Chasiv Yar. But also, we're getting a cascade of reports now of continued Russian advances in the Avdiivka Ocheretino area. The Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed the capture of Netailovo. It's expected to confirm soon the capture of Yasnobrodovka as well. Fighting continues to be underway in Novo-Alexandrovka, but the Russians supposedly are advancing inside this village. And the fighting in Krasnogorovka, as I said, has resumed, with Netailovo having fallen. The Russians appear to be gearing up for the final push to clear Krasnogorovka as well. Now, Radovka, alongside its analysis of the situation in Kharkiv region, has also provided a very interesting analysis of the situation in this part of the battlefront as well, in the Ocheretino, Avdiivka area. Now, Big Serge, extremely astute commentator, and Radovka have pointed out that the Russian advances in Ocheretino and around Ocheretino, in places like Alexandrovka and the other places, look like they are providing the foundation for a major Russian advance towards the northeast, surrounding Ukrainian forces in Toretsk and New York, and linking up with Russian forces pushing from Klishevka and perhaps ultimately Chasiv Yar towards Konstantinovka, essentially achieving a major strategic encirclement of the Ukrainians and breaking Ukrainian defenses in advance of the big culminating battles for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. But Radovka has also made a further point, which I think has been made by several others as well, which is that these Russian advances to the west of Ocheretino and Avdiivka, and it's difficult to convey the pace because the Russians at the moment appear to be advancing through fields more than anything else, but they are also apparently have now entered the village of Karlovka, which lies immediately to the west of Netailovo. Anyway, the point that is being made is that, especially if, or rather when, Karlovka is captured by the Russians, then the Russians will in effect have broken through the last area of the defense lines that Ukraine created in Donbass following the fighting in 2014 and the 2015. These defense lines, firstly, there was the Zelensky line, which has now essentially collapsed, but also some distance behind it, there was the so-called Poroshenko line, which, by the way, in terms of its fortifications, apparently, to all intents and purposes, now no longer exists. But that, it looks as if, with the fall of Karlovka in particular, it would have collapsed as well. And that will bring, with the Russians having taken Karlovka and some of these other villages, Novo-Alexandrovka and the rest, that will bring the Russians close to Ukraine's major reserve logistical hubs, the place where the Ukrainians gather their forces before and the supplies for their forces before they move them eastwards, or have moved them eastwards to the contact lines in the Donbass. And places that have been mentioned include the town of Selidovo, which the Russians supposedly are now just 13 kilometers from. If Karlovka falls, apparently Selidovka becomes an obvious target, and it's pointed out that the Russians are already within artillery range of Selidovo. But beyond Selidovo, other places, of which the most important ultimately is Pokrovsk itself. So the entire logistical operation that Ukraine has been operating in Donbass could start to come apart. All of the various logistical hubs and centers, the ones that had been set up by Ukraine behind the fortified lines, are now increasingly coming within reach. And again, I don't think it takes a lot of understanding of military matters to understand the relevance of that. Now, in a recent video, I explained that the Russians, for their part, seem to be building up major logistical centers, a major logistical center in Lugansk region, and there's been this Russian airfield that has been created, or is in the process of being created, in Belgorod region, in Russia itself. Well, anyway, it looks as if the rear areas of the Ukrainian forces in Donbass are about to be reached, even as Putin is casting into doubt the legitimacy of the man, Zelensky, who still says that he's the president of Ukraine, and even as doubts continue to grow in the West about Ukraine's future. Well, there we are. This is where I finish my program today. To repeat again, Russian warnings are now becoming stronger, but that simply reflects the overall danger of the current situation. There is no room for complacency. My colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, and believes that the green light to launch missile strikes against Russia was already made, and he's probably right, even though it might now have been pulled back, at least for a short time. And my other colleague, Len Deason, has also pointed out that as Russia's victory draws closer, the West becomes more desperate and more reckless, and in a sense, the most dangerous part of the conflict is now almost upon us. So there is no room for complacency, but it looks like in this terrifying poker game that is being played, the Russians have again won the latest trick. There we go. That's where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. If you want to support our work, you can do so via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget also that you can check out our shop, get yourself the amazing things that we have there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Have a very good day. More from me soon.